welcome back to Run Fast, Lift Heavy. Today I'm joined by Ash Grossman. Ash, thank you for taking the time to come on today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No worries. So before we get into it, I like to ask some warm-up questions. So my first one is, do you prefer running fast or lifting heavy?
Oh, that's tough actually. I think recently running fast, but probably
Yeah.
before that, lifting heavy would be my thing.
Good. So next question, what's the most influential book you've ever read?
Oh, that's a big one. I think The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Successful People.
Highly effective people.
Highly effective people.
Yeah.
That was
That was probably. When did you read that?
A good few years ago, I think. It's just one of those books that everyone recommends, right? And I think there's a lot of principles in there that are common amongst a lot of other productivity or self-improvement books, but it's just really well summarized, and I like the way he presents the points in that one.
Great answer. Next question. If you were to design a birthday WOD, what 3 movements would be in it and why?
Okay. Well, lunges, obviously, because lunges are life and the most functional movement out there. And running as well, transporting yourself from A to B. And then the third one would have to be the strict muscle up, which is, in my opinion, the king of upper body exercises.
Yeah. I've not heard that one before, the strict muscle up.
No. Yeah. Okay. The strict muscle up.
This one is quite broad, so feel free to take your time. But what makes you truly happy in life?
Okay. Wow, straight in the deep end today. Truly happy. I would say people is the main thing. So being surrounded by good people, and weather is a big one for me. I've realized over the last few years that that's really important. And that's pretty much it, isn't it? I think if you're in a good place with good people, everything else is kind of not that important.
Totally agree. And then the final question is actually from my previous guest. And it is, I hope you're not vegetarian. What's the best steak you've ever had and where was it from?
The best steak I've ever had was, there's a few, but I think the one that sticks out in my mind was an Icelandic steak from a restaurant quite close to me called Meseliau in Exmouth Market. And it was recommended as a special by the waiter. And it was probably about 70% fat. And it was just unbelievable. Like the melt in your mouth nature of the fat was like no other steak I've ever had before. And it was kind of very meaty and tasty in a traditional steak way, but just the texture was unrivaled. So I'd have to say that.
How much did it cost you?
I can't remember. It was it was for my birthday a few years ago, and we got a few different steaks to share between the tables. So it wasn't super expensive. It was just happened to be their special on that day.
Awesome. Okay, so just for our audience, could you briefly explain who you are, what you do?
Sure. So my name's Ash Grossman. I'm a coach and educator in the movement mechanics space. So I do, I guess my signature product is a muscle imbalance assessment, where I'll work with an athlete to identify what's going on in their body, which could be causing them pain or have resulted in an injury or could be holding back their performance. So it's kind of like a root cause analysis of what's going on, because as I think a lot of people now understand, the site of injury or pain isn't usually the cause of that injury or pain. So we kind of want to understand how the body's moving as a system to figure out what could be the original cause of that issue. And then I'll work with them either on a one-off basis, or I have some clients that I work with on a consistent basis for full programming, where we integrate the movement mechanics with their training, which I think is a massive missing piece from most rehab or movement style training methodologies, in that it really needs to link to what you want to be able to do with your body. There's no generic fixes for specific issues. You need to link those specific issues to the specific outcomes that individual wants for their body. And aside from that, I also run a company called The Training Stimulus, where I teach the movement mechanics methodology to other PTs and coaches, where it's very focused around the protocols for assessing from a generic perspective, but also then how do you tailor an assessment and corrective exercises for the individual. And it's not only to do a muscle imbalance assessment standalone, it's also to develop your coach's eye. So if you coach classes and you can see someone's got a hip shift in a squat, you can figure out what that might mean and how to quickly identify what their limiter could be. So can we just change their stance or give them one accessory exercise to help address what's going on?
And what led you to getting into movement mechanics and injury prevention?
Sure. I think like most people in this space, I'm sort of scratching my own itch in that when I was younger, I had a recurring neck and shoulder injury from playing rugby. When I was about 14, I had a whiplash-like injury, and it was bad, but not that bad. Like I had to take maybe just a matter of weeks off initially, and I'd have physiotherapy, do lots of stretches, do lots of shoulder rotator cuff work, and get some massage, ultrasound, all the sort of the normal treatments for that sort of injury. And it would slowly feel better, but then it would just reoccur if I played a game where I made a lot of tackles, or particularly if I pressed weight overhead or did pull-ups. My trap would basically spasm, and I couldn't turn my head right for a couple of days, and it was pretty annoying. So I'd go through this cycle periodically, probably having a flare up every couple of months. And it was annoying, but never annoying enough to take things further. I just thought, oh yeah, I'll just get the physio to help out. And this continued for about 10 years on and off. And I was playing rugby in my early 20s, working in an office, and just started to actually get quite frustrated because it was no different 10 years on than it was right at the start. So while I was in the office doing the job that I didn't really care for, I started scouring the internet, reading as much as I could about training. I'd always had a really strong passion and interest in training, sport, and exercise. So I had a sort of hobbyist level of knowledge around normal gym going. And that's when I discovered mobility training and functional training for performance and athleticism rather than just bodybuilding for aesthetics. And I sort of went down the rabbit hole, consuming everything I could around movement and how the body works and what might be causing these sorts of dysfunctions or issues. And basically, never stopped consuming as much knowledge as I could on that topic to try to understand how to speak to the body to get it to move in a way that is better for output and performance rather than just training individual muscles to grow or get stronger in a specific way.
Yeah. Something you touched on then is that you got injured, you'd see a physio, complete your prescribed exercises, and then in a few weeks it would happen again. So this to me, and I mean, I've done the same thing. I get neck twinges when I do handstand push-ups, and it happens literally every 2 months or so. But it seems really reactive rather than preventative. So I want to know how athletes and coaches can work together to prevent these injuries before they would occur. I mean, so you might need a bit more information than that because you need to look at how they're moving. But are there any protocols you would suggest people do before exercising?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's quite an open-ended one because obviously it's case by case depending on what's going on in an individual's body. But you hit the nail on the head there in that we need to be proactive rather than reactive. So the trap spasming was an outcome of what was going on beneath the surface. So there could be a variety of different things that led to it, but what we need to get clear on is what's the root cause. Like, why is that outcome being applied by your body as a strategy to deal with the stress that you're placing on it? So when you do loads of handstand push-ups, why does your body turn to tightening that trap to try and solve the problem or the question you're asking of it, and not use a solution that we would prefer, which would be using other muscle groups and letting the trap be a little bit more relaxed? So that's where we need to do a bit of digging through assessment to look at the way you move. It could be almost any other part of your body that's slacking or not doing its job in the way that we want it to. But once we figure that out, then we can design or select some exercises that provide the right training stimulus for your body to perform a handstand push-up in a more optimal way. And this is where things like motor patterns or muscle sequencing come into the question, because essentially that's what's leading to the trap spasming, is that your body doesn't know how to perform that task in the best way possible. So it just says, right, I want to, say, for example, stabilize that shoulder, and I'm not getting stability from anywhere else. So all I'm going to do is lock out that neck or that trap to provide some semblance of stability. And it's obviously not ideal, but it gets the job done in a sort of quick and dirty way.
Yeah. Something that I've really wanted to ask you is, so when I think back to school PE, before the session, we were told to do dynamic stretching, and then afterwards it was static stretching. Does stretching actually help with injury prevention, or, loosening the muscles?
Yeah, big one.
Is there a place for it?
So it's important to distinguish between dynamic and static stretching. So it's quite a complex topic in terms of the anatomy of the muscle and what you're actually stimulating by doing one versus the other. The simplest way to think about it, if you're doing long static stretches, you're asking your body to relax those muscles and turn them off and give you more passive range of motion, which is very rarely what we want in the training or performance space. We want responsive muscles that can lengthen but will shorten in response quickly or powerfully. That's ultimately what performance is, right? Quick or powerful contractions from a muscle or enduring. So static stretching, for me, in the athletic space, doesn't have a place in terms of getting somebody to move better or reduce the propensity for injury. If anything, for the people I see with injuries, the overwhelming majority of them are too flexible and can do with more tension rather than more flexibility. The dynamic stretching side of things is definitely useful in terms of preparing the body for the movements you're about to ask it to do. So what you don't want going into a training session or a competition or match is system shock. You don't want your body to suddenly go into a position or a shape that it isn't expecting, because the body doesn't like sudden changes. It likes to be well informed of what's about to happen. So it's why you get your heart rate up, why you get slightly out of breath to produce an optimal performance, is so that it's not a sudden spike to heart rate or breathing. Same applies for muscles, in that if we're going to ask a muscle to go in and out of a certain length or range of motion, it's a great idea to have exposed it to those positions slowly and gradually, going from transitioning from whatever activity you're doing before to the more challenging one. So dynamic or pulse stretching, I would definitely recommend as a warm-up.
Yeah, because when I think about static stretching, we're asking the muscle to loosen itself. But on the flip side of that, if we're training for strength adaptation, then it would be in our preference to have a tight muscle.
Definitely.
Because muscle only creates force through the contraction. So the ability to create tension is what makes us strong. And I think it's difficult because apps like GoWOD and WrongWOD, all the high-level CrossFit athletes are sponsored by them, and I think it feels really good to stretch, and it can be good for your body and mind. But if we're looking for strength, then they're not actually going to help you, and they're marketed as injury prevention. But like you said, instead of seeking flexibility, range of motion would be in our favor.
Exactly. That's a really important distinction, that active range of motion is almost always a good thing if we can control it and generate tension from that range, whereas passive range of motion can be a bad thing, in that we can expose our body to positions where it doesn't have strength or robustness, and then that's when the more serious injuries can happen, because we're no longer decelerating emotion using our muscles. That's when we get more into tendons and ligaments, and if they get damaged, it's a much more serious thing than a small muscle tear, which is not that big a deal.
Yeah. Again, quite a broad question for you, but what's the most common injury you work with? And I'm thinking more in the sport of CrossFit.
I think the most common one is lower back issues in deadlifting. Just because of the modern lifestyle and the way our bodies are conditioned outside of the gym, it tends to mean that we can get away, or we tend towards faulty hinge patterns. So if we distilled it to be super oversimplified, that would mean we're not using our hips and glutes or hamstrings very well, and we're using our backs more than is ideal. And our lumbar spines are not designed for huge amounts of movement. They tend towards stiffness and stability as compared to the other parts of the back. So when we do a lot of deadlifting or heavy deadlifting and that lumbar's asked to do more than ideal, it tends to complain. So that's probably the number one in terms of frequency that you see in CrossFit.
And do you think another cause of the injury could be doing too much too soon?
Yeah.
You know, in a sport where people race in pull-ups, you know, a set amount of pull-ups for time, you might rush to go for kipping movements because they're faster without having the ability to do strict pull-ups. Would you say that is a common cause of injuries?
Yeah, that would be the most common cause of injuries. Mm-hmm. Like if we were ignoring the mechanism of injury, the overall root cause is too much too soon. Like if we break down what an injury is, you've exceeded your tissue tolerance, so your body can't handle what you've asked it to do. And that could be acute in that it happens in a moment where there's a collision or an incident or a fall or something where, you know, the tolerance of a bone gets exceeded and it breaks, or it can be chronic over time. And with a sport like CrossFit, like you say, because the demands can be very high and people can get carried away and want to progress as quickly as possible, their mental strength and their will can exceed their physical strength quite easily. So I like to say the body can adapt to almost anything if you go slow enough. So by going quickly, you're much more likely to find out if you've got any imbalances or dysfunction in the body, because you're just layering on so much volume that the body will give you feedback. Whereas if you progressed slowly but steadily, even if your mechanics aren't great, your tissues will increase their tolerance quite in line with the rate of progression in your training. So like a classic example of this is tendons, right? So patella tendonitis, or a lot of people get tendon issues in their wrists from CrossFit. But if you progress slowly and surely, and if you look at weightlifters or gymnasts, where they have done the same movements over long periods of time, they have incredibly thick tendons, which some people might view as an indication of poor mechanics or overuse. But if there's no pain and no injury, a thick tendon is actually stronger and more robust. So they've built those tendons up over time because they've sensibly progressed. Whereas if you laid on huge amounts of volume, you would get a tendonitis in those tendons because they're just not ready for it. So too much too soon. And I think the extra challenge with CrossFit is because the nature of competition is ready for anything. You can be asked to do random workouts that you haven't progressively built up to. So your body, it is that system shock that your body's not quite ready for. And that's part of the challenge and fun of the sport, right? Is that you don't know what's coming up, but then from a physiological adaptation point of view, it's quite tricky to prepare the body fully for any eventuality.
Yeah, cool. I want to go through a game of overrated versus underrated with you. Sure. And I've done some topics in the realm of fitness recovery, injury prevention. And I think it would be good to help point our audience into what's marketing and what's actually going to be beneficial for them.
Okay.
So the first one is massage guns for recovery. Are they worth it?
For recovery, so...
Yeah. So to potentially get out knots in muscles, or, you know, get the blood flowing.
So they'll get the blood flowing and they'll ease the feeling of knots. But I'd still say they're overrated in that knots aren't really an issue. Knots, it's quite a long discussion, but essentially they're just local spots of tightness where the nerve meets the muscle. So everyone has the same knots in the same places. So people think that a muscle should have no knots. All muscles have knots. It's just the level of tone going through that muscle. So overrated.
Okay, cool. That's good to know. Next one, toe spacers. So they've been popularized by, again, a lot of CrossFit athletes are sponsored by big brands, and they're designed to realign feet to the natural position. Do you think there's a place for this?
There is a place for it, and I actually did a podcast episode on it on lunge and lift. If you want to check that out for a longer explanation, but it's a very specific use case where somebody has quite severe changes to their toe alignment, where you might use that But the analogy I like for the toe spaces is if somebody had bad posture, you wouldn't just strap their spine to an iron rod to try and straighten it out. And toe posture, they're bones, right? So they take a while to change position and adapt. And if you're trying to forcibly change them with a physical structure, it's a very aggressive strategy. So I would actually push people towards more barefoot, walking around, walking on textured floors, and improving your foot mechanics to slowly change the orientation of your toes rather than trying to force them at it's again like it's a quick pace of change which can cause issues in the feet, whereas unless there's a really significant problem with your feet, what's the rush? They'll naturally get better over time if you choose better footwear and have better foot health practices.
Well, you covered the next question, which was barefoot shoes. Would it be possible for you to quickly explain why there's a need for them? The extent to why I know is that they develop natural movement of the feet and prevent deformities. When we think about wearing a shoe, our toes being pushed together, they've got a pointy end, especially high heels. Not that I wear them too often. So why might we need barefoot shoes, and why might our toes coming in be a bad thing?
Yeah, so foot mechanics would be something that I'd say is massively underrated in terms of how we move, and the foot is our main point of contact with the world and our environment. So it sets like a chain reaction in motion every time we take a step. We are getting a lot of information from the floor in terms of our position in space, like where is our weight distributed, what's the angle of the floor, are there lumps in the floor, all these sorts of things which trigger a chain reaction up the body to provide corresponding muscle contractions. So if we're leaning too far one way, one side of the body will contract. If we're leaning too far the other, and that's happening 360 degrees all the time while we're walking. So thick footwear or footwear that smashes our toes together, we're basically dulling that sensory input. So we're not getting as accurate or as clear signals about our position in space. So over time, this can lead to maladaptive strategies. So people rolling to one side of the foot, either like going flat-footed and dumping their weight to the medial arch, or in CrossFit, it's very common pathology to see people drive their knees excessively out and just use the lateral arch of the foot and the big toes barely on the floor. And that can cause a whole host of issues upstream, not using your hips correctly, back pain, even shoulder pain in extreme situations. So by building a better connection between our feet and the rest of our body, we have a great opportunity to just sync everything up. So the muscles speak to each other better. And I don't want to go too deep into this. I'd recommend checking out Gary Ward for talks about pronation and supination. But we can think of pronation as almost like the global loading of our body starting at the foot. So when we take a step, everything stretches, lengthens, and prepares to contract. And we can compare this to descent in a squat. As we lower down, the body's preparing to then fire out of the bottom. And this could be standing up a squat, it could be jumping in weightlifting, it could be obviously sprinting and jumping in sport. So it all starts with the feet. So having a good appreciation for foot mechanics can really supercharge the rest of our training.
Yeah, I've not actually invested in a pair of barefoot shoes, but when I go on dog walks, I now take my shoes off completely, just leave them in the lead under a tree and then walk around the park. And when I used to run, I used to get a hip pinch, and it's completely gone. And the only thing I've changed is an hour of day of barefoot walking.
Awesome.
And it's something that I've recommended to a few people, and they've had similar effects. So
Brilliant.
Yeah, definitely underrated. Okay, next one, similar to massage guns, but it's foam rolling. Is it
overrated?
Is it useful? Yeah.
Overrated. There are some applications where you can see some benefit, but I'm quite brutal with time allocation. So I think the amount of time it takes to foam roll somewhere, you'd be better off just doing a movement, doing a stretch. With all of these things, it depends what stimulus you're trying to get out of them.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to improve range of motion to get ready to squat, and people foam roll their calves or foam roll their adductors, just stretch them out, do something that looks a little bit more like a squat, spend some time in the position, and you will improve your mobility in the squat way faster than applying the same amount of time to foam rolling individual muscles at a time.
Another topic, quite controversial, and I think it's why a lot of people don't like CrossFit, is the whole kipping movement. Do you think that kipping movements are essential for general population people to get fit?
Absolutely not. People
I
got by
completely agree.
for a very long period of time without kipping, so
Yeah.
I don't think it's essential for an everyday person. Like,
Yeah.
the question you ask is like, would you get your mum or your granny to kip? Like what? I think this is where the CrossFit thing is an interesting discussion, because it's both a sport and a training methodology, and it gets blurry as to when one becomes the other. And one of the tenets of the training methodology is that they're functional movements, so they have carryover to normal day-to-day life. And the only people who do kipping in normal life would be gymnasts, as far as I can tell. So that's very specific rather than general physical preparedness. And I think it's fun and it's a cool skill to unlock. And that journey of skill development is fun almost for any movement, but that doesn't mean that it's a good movement just because it's fun to do. And I think you've got to always ask, like, what's the adaptation you want from the body, from the movement? And when you look at squats, deadlifts, lunges, all those sorts of things, there's quite a clear application to day-to-day life and normal tasks that people demand from their body, whereas kipping from a pull-up bar or from rings is quite tenuous, to say the least.
Yeah, when I think about becoming fit, and even for myself now, not just my clients, I want to be able to, one day run a 5K park run, or the next day hike up Snowdon, or pick up heavy shopping. And doing a kipping set of chest bar pull-ups isn't necessarily going to help me with life, which is what I think functional movement should help you for.
Definitely.
But like we said, it's a sport and it's competitive racing, fitness racing, and that, they're going to be tested.
Exactly. For the sport, everything's fair game.
Yeah.
In the sport of CrossFit, it's a show and a spectacle as much as it is a test of fitness. And you've got to think of the commercial side of it, in that if it was just a real simple test of like squat, bench, deads, 5K run, 2K row, like 20K cycle or something, that's not great entertainment, and it's not very exciting. It's also less fun for the athletes to train for. So the variety and the introduction of new interesting movements makes it a fun sport to participate. But what we need to be clear on is that we're not saying that's what the normal person should be trying to do. Because like a freestanding handstand push-up is such a niche movement, and it's really cool, but that's not to say that it's something that everyone should be working towards, because the application to their day-to-day life doesn't really merit the time investment that it would take to get there.
Yeah. I'd like to finish off by going through a hypothetical scenario with you. So it's something that I heard Adrian Bosman and Pat Sherwood talk through. So the scenario is, you're going on a desert island with a person and they have to complete a task, and we don't know what the task is. There are 3 people you can choose from. One person is a man, they all are men. He has a 120 kilo snatch. The second guy has a sub 7-minute 2K row. And then the third guy can do 30 strict pull-ups unbroken. Which one are you going for to help you with the task on the desert island?
A task on a desert island. It's a good question, that. So the way I'm thinking about it is like, what sort of tasks would we have on a desert island? And it would probably be some sort of carrying, lifting, building type thing. So you know what? I think I would actually go for the rower. So sub 7 row.
Yeah.
So if you can row sub 7, they're baked in that is a decent level of strength. You can't pull sub 7 without actually quite a decent level of strength. And they're also going to have a good work capacity. They're also going to have good grip. So in terms of like application to day-to-day life, I think that's probably who I'd put my money on. The snatch, he could gas out in 10 seconds, so you can't run him. And the pull-ups, you don't know what his legs are like. So it's, as much as I'd like to say pull-ups, rower wins.
Yeah, when I first heard it, I immediately went for pull-ups because 30 is such a large number. But then when you think about it, the training that would go into a sub 7 minute 2K row, you'd have to be doing 30-minute plus, aerobic work. But then also, like, it's so brutal to even pull that for a minute, so that they'd be so strong and so powerful. Then the snatch person, the only thing that they'd be good for on a desert island would be picking up logs of wood and then pressing it overhead
in one
for,
movement.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Totally.
And I think the other thing with the pull-up guy is that he might be really light, because some people, they can only do a lot of pull-ups because they're very light. So that means they're not so good with carrying heavy weights.
Yeah, I was thinking of like athletes who would, who could be able to do that. So I was thinking, would Simone Biles, the gymnast, be good to have on a desert island? Because I imagine that she could do 30 strict pull-ups, but I don't think she'd be that good to have with me.
Yeah, compared to like a good rower, I think. They'll probably have a bit more going for them.
Cool. So to finish off, I asked you a question from my previous guest at the start. They went for steak. Could you please come up with a question that I can ask for my next guest?
Do we know who the next guest is, or is it unknown?
No, I'm going to keep it a complete secret.
Okay. So question for the next guest is an embarrassing story that you haven't told many people.
It's funny, when I first started doing this, because I know Stephen, the guy with CEO, he asked this question on his podcast.
Oh, does he?
And they're all like self-help related. And so far, these haven't been that, but it's brilliant. So embarrassing story, haven't told anyone. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ash. I really appreciate your time with this. Where can people find you?
So I am ashgrossman.coach on Instagram, or _training_stimulus for the movement mechanics mentorship stuff. And I also have my own podcast, which I co-host with Rob Stubbs, called Lunge and Lift, which is on all the normal podcast channels and at lunge.lift on Instagram.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Great to speak.